The Color of Thoughts. Prologue. In the quiet of his room, with the Arizona sun setting outside his window, Jake Martinez sat in focused solitude. The task at hand was delicate and demanding, honing his ability to tap into the thoughts of others without the need for physical contact. He hadn't mastered it yet, but his determination was unwavering. Jake's journey into the realm of mind reading began in childhood. Initially, it manifested as faint impressions and blurry emotions. With time, however, these abilities sharpened, evolving into a clear, albeit unwanted, reception of the inner voices surrounding him. The cacophony of unspoken thoughts was overwhelming and frightening, driving him to guard this secret with utmost care. He was acutely aware of the consequences if his power were ever exposed. The fear of being ostracized, branded a freak, loomed over him. Thus, from a tender age, Jake had become adept at quieting the relentless mental noise, mastering the art of blending into the mundane rhythms of school life. But recently, a new challenge had emerged in the form of Mark Thompson, the charismatic new kid at Jefferson High. With his easy smile and air of mystery, Mark quickly climbed the social ladder. Jake, however, sensed a hidden darkness beneath that charming exterior. His telepathic glimpses revealed snippets of a troubled, possibly criminal past, though the specifics eluded him. Mark's initial overtures had appeared innocuous, possibly even the beginnings of an unexpected friendship. Yet, as Jake would soon discover, Mark had somehow seen through his carefully constructed facade. Mark's awareness of Jake's secret marked a turning point, propelling him towards a vortex of manipulation and danger as he was reluctantly entwined in Mark's increasingly perilous plans. Chapter 1, A flashback of friendship and trouble. The schoolyard of Jefferson High was a kaleidoscope of the 1960s Southwest. Amidst the clamor of students, the air carried a blend of youthful exuberance and the unspoken tensions of the era. Here, under the relentless Arizona sun, Jake Martinez navigated his teenage years with a secret tucked deep within his mind. Jake, a quiet, thoughtful boy, often found himself lost in the thoughts of others, not by choice, but by an ability he couldn't explain. His telepathic gift was a hidden burden, one he dared not share. It was here, in the dusty confines of the schoolyard, that Jake first encountered Mark Lewis. Mark, with his disarming grin and a rebellious glint in his eye, was a newcomer with a shadow of a checkered past. Their meeting was serendipitous, a moment of mischief that had pulled Jake out of his shell and into an exciting and dangerous friendship. The incident that bonded them was still vivid in Jake's mind. A group of older bullies, notorious in the school, had cornered Mark, their jeers cutting through the air like knives. Jake had watched, his heart racing, as he unintentionally tapped into the thoughts of the aggressors, sensing their next moves. In a moment of unprecedented bravery, he had intervened, using his insight to help Mark outmaneuver them. Confused and embarrassed, the bullies retreated, leaving Mark with a newfound respect for Jake. That evening, under the fading light, Mark confronted Jake. "How did you do that?" he had asked, his curiosity piercing. "It's like you knew exactly what they were thinking." Jake had faltered, the fear of exposure tightening in his chest. "Just lucky, I guess," he had muttered, but the look in Mark's eyes told him that the answer was insufficient. From that day on, their friendship took on a new dimension, with Mark's intrigue into Jake's abilities becoming an obsession. Brought by loyalty and fear, Jake became increasingly entangled in Mark's schemes. As Jake sat in his room, the memories playing like an old film, he couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The sound of his mother calling him for dinner snapped him back to reality. He took a deep breath, burying his secret once more, and stepped out of his room into the normalcy of family life, leaving his worries behind the closed door. See Chapter 2, The Unwilling Accomplice. The school corridors felt narrower than ever as Jake navigated them the next day. His conversation with Mark the evening prior echoed in his mind, a relentless reminder of the precarious situation he found himself in. He knew Mark was not someone to be taken lightly, especially now that his secret was out. As he turned a corner, he came face to face with Mark, leaning casually against a locker with that characteristic smirk. "Hey, Mindreader," Mark greeted him, his voice dripping with amusement and threat. "Had some thoughts about our little chat?" Jake's stomach tightened. "Mark, I can't help you with whatever you're planning. It's wrong, and I won't be a part of it." Mark's expression hardened. "Not even if it means keeping your freaky little talent a secret?" The word freak hit Jake like a physical blow. He had always feared that label, and hearing it from Mark reminded him of his vulnerability. "What do you want?" Jake asked, resignation seeping into his voice. Mark's smile returned triumphant. "There's a poker game tonight. Some rich kids from the West Side. You're going to help me win." Jake felt trapped. The thought of using his abilities for something so deceitful was disgusting, but the alternative, his secret exposed, was unthinkable. "Fine," he muttered, "but this is a one-time thing." "That's my boy," Mark clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture that felt more like a shackle. That evening, Jake found him a lit basement, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the clink of poker chips. He sat beside Mark, trying to focus on the player's thoughts, strategies, and bluffs. Each information he relayed to Mark felt like a betrayal of his morals. The game was going in their favor, but Jake's discomfort grew with every hand. And then, without warning, it happened as he delved into the mind of their primary opponent. A surge of pain shot through his head like a backlash of mental energy. He gasped, clutching his temples. "Hey, what's wrong with him?" one of the players asked, suspicion in his voice. Mark acted quickly, half supporting, half dragging Jake to his feet. "He's just sick. We gotta go," he said, hastily collecting their winnings. As they left the house, the cool night air did little to ease Jake's headache. He felt nauseous, not just from the pain but from the realization of how deeply he had been dragged into Mark's world. The threat of exposure had never felt so real nor so dangerous. Chapter 3, Suspicions and Strained Alliances. The unease that had settled in Jake's chest was like a persistent shadow following him through the corridors of Jefferson High. He moved from class to class, his interactions were mechanical, his mind tumultuous with regret and apprehension. The previous night's events played on a loop in his head, each recall deepening his guilt. Emma Watson, with her observant eyes and quiet demeanor, had always had a knack for noticing what others overlooked. Lately, she found herself increasingly concerned about Jake. They weren't close friends, but they shared a few classes, and she had always found his quiet, thoughtful nature intriguing. Now, something was different about him: attention, awareness that wasn't there before. As she watched Jake from across the library, her curiosity deepened. He seemed on edge, glancing frequently over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. It was out of character for the Jake she knew. Later, as the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Emma saw Jake hurriedly leave the classroom, only to be intercepted by Mark Thompson. She couldn't hear their words, but the body language was enough. Mark was assertive, almost aggressive, while Jake looked like he was desperately trying to disengage. Emma's instincts told her something was amiss. She made a mental note to keep an eye on the situation. Meanwhile, Jake's confrontation with Mark was reaching a boiling point. "I can't keep doing this, Mark," Jake hissed lowlice. "What we did was wrong, and I want no part of it anymore." Mark's response was a cold laugh. "You think you have a choice, Jake? You're in this as deep as I am now. And I have plans for us." Plans that Jake wanted no part of. He could feel the walls closing in, the options dwindling. The thought of being further embroiled in Mark's schemes was unbearable. But the fear of exposing his secret was a powerful deterrent, keeping him tethered to Mark's side. As Jake walked home, his thoughts were a whirlwind. He barely noticed the fading daylight or the familiar streets of his neighborhood. His mind was on Emma's face, how she had been looking at him lately. Did she suspect something? Could she help him? Or would confiding in her only put her in danger, too? That night, Jake lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The weight of his secret, the complexity of his predicament, felt crushing. He knew he had to find a way out, but every potential solution seemed to lead to more problems. And in the back of his mind, the fear. Chapter 4, Dangerous Schemes and Unforeseen Rescues. The air was tense as Mark outlined his plan calmly and urgently. They were huddled in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place that reeked of decay and forgotten stories. Jake's stomach churned with anxiety. Mark's scheme was not just reckless, it was perilous, a break-in at the home of an infamous local criminal known for his violent tendencies. "You've lost your mind," Jake whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. "We can't do this, Mark. It's too dangerous." Mark's eyes, alight with a dangerous mix of excitement and desperation, bore into him. "We're already in this deep, Jake. Besides, with your talent, we'll be in and out before anyone knows." Jake felt trapped, a sensation that had become all too familiar. He knew they were crossing a line from which there was no return. Unbeknownst to them, Emma Watson had been piecing together the puzzle of Jake's recent behavior. Her intuition led her to follow them, staying just out of sight, driven by concern and curiosity. Now, hidden in the shadows, she watched the scene unfold with growing apprehension. The night of the heist, they arrived with a moonless sky as if nature disapproved of their deeds. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as they approached the target house. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but the thought of Mark revealing his secret kept him rooted to the plan. Inside the house was a labyrinth of shadows and silence. Jake used his ability to scan for thoughts, a beacon in the dark guiding them through the dangerous terrain. When it happened, they were almost to their objective, a sudden, sharp mental feedback that staggered Jake. He stumbled, knocking over a vase. The sound shattered the silence like a gunshot. Lights flicked on, and shouts filled the air. They were discovered. In the ensuing chaos, Emma emerged from her hiding spot. Her decision to intervene was impulsive, driven by a fierce desire to protect Jake. She created a distraction, allowing Jake a moment to regain his composure and flee. The two ran through darkened streets, the adrenaline and fear propelling them. It wasn't until they were safe in the shadows of an alley that they dared to stop. "Emma, why did you follow us?" Jake panted, the reality of the night's events sinking in. Emma's expression was a mix of worry and determination. "I knew something was wrong. I had to make sure you were okay." The truth spilled from Jake, and then there was an uncontrollable torrent of confessions about his abilities and his entanglement with Mark. Emma listened, her expression shifting from shock to understanding. "We need to go to the police," she insisted once he finished. But Jake shook his head, the fear of exposure overwhelming. "No, I can't. They wouldn't understand. They'd think I'm a freak." Emma's hand reached out, gripping his in a reassuring hold. "Then we'll figure this out together. But you can't go back to Mark. You can't." As they sat in the dim light of the alley, a new alliance formed between them, one born of necessity but fortified by trust. Little did they know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would test them in ways they couldn't imagine. Of what Mark might do next lingered, a constant, menacing presence. Chapter 5, Unraveling Plans and Unlikely Allies. The morning after the botched heist was a tapestry of chaos and whispers. Police cars dotted the front of the school, their flashing lights casting long, ominous shadows. Jake's heart pounded as he navigated the crowd of curious students, each glance and whisper feeling like an accusation. Detective Harris, a stern man with sharp eyes inside the principal's office, questioned Jake. "We have reason to believe you might know something about an incident last night," he said, his gaze unwavering. Jake's mind raced. He reached out with his abilities, gently brushing against the detective's thoughts, steering the suspicions away from himself and Mark. I was home all night, Jake lied, his voice steady despite the turmoil. Outside, Emma watched with furrowed brows. The police presence, the rumors swirling through the halls, and Jake's pale, drawn face all added to something dangerous. When Jake emerged from the office, she approached him. "We need to talk," she insisted, pulling him aside. In the quiet of the school library, Emma offered a lifeline. "My father, he's a lawyer. He can help you, Jake. But you need to be honest with him. With me." The offer was tempting, but Jake hesitated, a beacon in the storm. Involving Emma's father meant revealing his secret, exposing himself to even more risk. "I can't," he finally said, the weight of his decision heavy in his voice. Emma's expression was a mix of frustration and concern. "You can't keep going like this, Jake. It's only going to get worse." Before Jake could respond, his phone buzzed. Mark's message was clear and ominous: "We need to meet. Now." The confrontation with Mark was inevitable. Mark's desperation was palpable in an abandoned lot, away from prying eyes. "The cops are sniffing around, Jake. We need to stick together, or we're both going down." Jake's resolve wavered under the weight of Mark's threats. The complexity of his situation, the tangled web of lies and secrets, felt suffocating. Yet, the thought of dragging Emma and her father into this mess was unbearable. Jake's mind was a battleground of fear, guilt, and desperation as he walked home. Emma's offer echoed in his ears, a tempting escape from the nightmare his life had become. But the risks were too significant. He wouldn't put her in danger. That night, a new development shook Jake to his core. Anonymous threats began to appear, messages that hinted at revenge from the criminal they had tried to rob. The situation was spiraling out of control, and Jake felt utterly alone in the eye of the storm. With each passing moment, the walls seemed to close in on him. Jake knew he had to make a decision, and soon. But each option led to more darkness, more danger. And through it all, the only glimmer of light was Emma, her strength, her willingness to help. But could he risk it? Could he risk her? Chapter 6, Confessions and Consequences. Jake's decision hung like a heavy fog as he sat across from Police Chief Watson, Emma's father. The chief's office, adorned with commendations and family pictures, felt intimidating and comforting. Jake's voice was barely above a whisper as he recounted everything: his telepathic abilities, his unwilling involvement in Mark's schemes, and the recent threats. Chief Watson listened intently, his expression a complex tapestry of shock, concern, and contemplation. Once Jake finished, there was a moment of heavy silence. "Son, this is a lot to take in. But I believe you," he finally said, his tone firm yet gentle. "We must handle this carefully, but I promise to protect you. We can sort this out." Relief, brief and fragile, washed over Jake. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was a glimmer of hope. Meanwhile, Mark's impatience was growing. He cornered Jake at school the next day, his words laced with urgency and threat. "We need to make another move, and soon." But Jake was different now. Mark's coercion no longer swayed him. "I'm done, Mark. I can't keep doing this," he said, his newfound resolve bolstering his voice. Mark sneered, a dark promise in his eyes. "You'll regret this, Jake." The news of Chief Watson's tragic accident came the following morning. It was a shock that rippled through the community, a car crash, sudden and fatal. To Jake, however, it wasn't just a tragedy but a catastrophe. His protector, his confidant, was gone. As he remembered Mark's parting threat, suspicion and fear coiled in Jake's stomach. A sinking feeling told him that this was no accident. Mark had taken the most drastic step to keep him in line and silent. The world seemed to close in around Jake. The police, now led by officers who knew nothing of his secret or deal with the chief, looked at him suspiciously. Rumors swirled, and whispers followed him in the hallways and streets. The promise of protection had vanished, replaced by an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. As Jake sat alone in his room that night, the walls of his world seemed to crumble. He was more isolated than ever, a target of the law and the criminal world. Trusting anyone seemed impossible, yet he couldn't face this alone. In the depths of his despair, Jake realized one person might still stand by him, Emma. But reaching out to her now meant pulling her into his dangerous world. Could he risk her safety the way he had threatened his own? The chapter closes with Jake grappling with this dilemma, torn between his need for help and his desire to protect Emma. The stakes had never been higher, and his next move would be critical. Chapter 7, No Way Out. The absence of Chief Watson hung over Jake like a shroud, each passing day a stark reminder of his newfound vulnerability. The once familiar streets of his neighborhood now seemed fraught with unseen dangers, each glance over his shoulder tinged with paranoia. Mark, seizing the opportunity, tightened his grip. He cornered Jake after school, his words a blend of threats and twisted encouragement. "We're doing one last job, Jake. Something big. We hit this, and all our problems go away." The plan was audacious, stealing from a criminal gang known for cruelty. Jake's stomach twisted in fear at the thought. "Mark, this is insane. We can't go up against them." But Mark was relentless. "You don't have a choice, Jake. You're in this as deep as I am." The night of the heist was a blur of adrenaline and fear. Jake's telepathy guided them through the gang's hideout, a dilapidated warehouse on the edge of town. Each step was fraught with danger, each whispered thought he intercepted amplifying the tension. They were close to their objective when disaster struck. Like nothing Jake had ever encountered, an unexpected mental barrier pushed back against his probing thoughts. It was as if someone or something was shielding the gang's intentions. Disoriented and exposed, they were quickly surrounded. Captured, Jake and Mark found themselves facing the gang's leader, a man whose reputation for cruelty was well known in the underworld. His cold, calculating gaze sent shivers down Jake's spine. "What do we have here?" the leader sneered, circling them like a predator. "A couple of kids playing at being thieves." Mark tried to bluster their way out, but his words were brushed aside. The gang leader was more interested in Jake, sensing something different about him. "And what's your story?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. Jake remained silent, fear constricting his throat. He could feel the leader's curiosity, a dangerous and probing presence. The chapter ends with Jake and Mark in the gang's clutches, their fate hanging in the balance. The failed heist had not only endangered them further but had also piqued the interest of a dangerous new player. Jake's secret was closer than ever to being exposed. This time, there might be no escape. Chapter 8, Betrayals and Rescues. In the dimly lit confines of the gang's hideout, Jake and Mark sat bound and closely watched. The air was thick with tension and unspoken threats. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a stark reminder of their dire situation. Mark's eyes darted around, seeking an escape that didn't exist. The betrayal came suddenly, yet not entirely unexpectedly. In a desperate bid for freedom, Mark turned to the gang leader. "The kid, he's got something you'll want. He can read minds. Think of how you could use that," he exclaimed, his voice trembling with fear. Jake's world reeled. The sting of Mark's betrayal cut deeper than fear. He had known Mark was selfish, but this betrayal was a new low. The gang leader, a man with cold, calculating eyes, turned his attention to Jake. "Is that so?" he mused, a cruel smile on his lips. "You could be precious to me." Jake remained silent, his mind racing for a way out. Though limited under stress, his telepathic ability allowed him to sense the guards' movements. Seizing a moment of distraction, he whispered a plan to Mark, hoping to use their combined efforts to escape. Their attempt was fraught with danger, a desperate scramble through a maze of corridors and exits. They were close to freedom when Mark made his final, damning choice. In chaos, he pushed Jake towards the pursuers and bolted in the opposite direction. Stunned and hurtling towards the ground, Jake's heart sank. Mark had abandoned him. Left to fend for himself, he tried to rise, but the gang members were upon him. Just then, a car screeched to a halt outside. Doors slammed, and voices shouted. Emma, having followed a trail of clues, had brought help. The gang members, caught off guard, scattered. Emma rushed to Jake's side, helping him to his feet. "Are you okay?" she asked, her eyes wide with concern. Jake nodded, still processing the night's events. "I can't believe Mark." "We need to get out of here," Emma interrupted, pulling him towards the car. As they drove away, the reality of his situation settled in. Mark had betrayed him, and now the gang knew about his abilities. He was more vulnerable than ever, but he wasn't alone. Emma had come for him, risking her safety. The chapter ends with Jake and Emma together, a sense of camaraderie and trust forming between them. The night's events had changed everything. Jake knew he couldn't return to his old life, but with Emma by his side, there was a flicker of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, and danger still lurked in the shadows, but for the first time in a long while, Jake didn't feel completely lost. Chapter 9, Recovery and Rising Tensions. The soft hum of a ceiling fan was the only sound in the small, secluded cabin where Jake convalesced. It was Emma's idea, tucked away on the outskirts of town, a haven borrowed from a family friend. Here, amid the rustic calm, Jake found a semblance of peace, a stark contrast to the chaos of recent days. Emma was a constant presence, her care for Jake evident in her actions. She brought him food, talked, and listened when he needed to vent his fears and frustrations. In these quiet moments, a bond strengthened, rooted in shared adversity and genuine care. But the tranquility of the cabin couldn't fully shield Jake from the reality of his situation. Mark's betrayal lingered in his mind like a dark cloud, and the threat from the gang loomed large. He knew they were far from safe. Emma handed Jake a folded note one evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow through the cabin windows. "This was left at the front door," she said, tense. It was from Mark, a thinly veiled threat not just against Jake but against Emma as well. The message was clear: Mark was desperate and dangerous, and he blamed Jake for his predicament. Jake's hands trembled as he read the note. The idea of Emma being dragged into this nightmare because of him was unbearable. "I can't let him hurt you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma sat beside him, her expression resolute. "We can't just run, Jake. We have to face this together." The decision to confront Mark and the gang was heavy, but Jake knew Emma was right. Running would only prolong their danger. He needed to end this for their safety. Together, they began to plan. It was a risky endeavor, requiring careful thought and preparation. Jake's abilities would be crucial, but they needed more than that. They needed a solid strategy and perhaps a bit of luck. As they worked late into the night, mapping out their approach, a new sense of determination settled over them. They were no longer just running, no longer just surviving. They were taking control, fighting against the forces that sought to overpower them. The chapter closes with Jake and Emma, their plan in place, ready to face whatever the next day would bring. The cabin's quiet was no longer just a refuge, it was a war room, the birthplace of their counterstrike. The final confrontation was imminent, and they were as ready as ever. Chapter 10, The Final Confrontation. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town stood under the cloak of night, its silhouette a stark reminder of the confrontations it was about to witness. Inside, Jake and Emma waited for their plan to set, hearts racing with fear and determination. They didn't have to wait long. Backed by gang members, Mark arrived, confidence oozing from his every step. The sight of Jake made his eyes narrow with a vindictive glee. "Thought you could outsmart me, huh?" he sneered. But Jake was not the same person Mark had manipulated before. He stood tall, his resolve fortified by all he had endured. "This ends tonight, Mark. No more games." As Mark laughed, dismissing Jake's words, Jake reached out with his mind. He carefully sifted through the thoughts of the gang members, subtly planting seeds of doubt and discord. The group's unity began to fray, their focus shifting from Jake and Emma to internal suspicions. The showdown with Mark was fraught with tension. Words were exchanged, accusations and threats thrown like daggers. But when Mark lunged at Jake, fueled by rage, Jake didn't use his telepathy to fight back. Instead, he sidestepped, allowing Mark to stumble forward, his momentum betraying him. It was a symbolic refusal to sink to Mark's level. The gang, now embroiled in their conflicts, barely noticed as Mark was apprehended. Emma, who had silently supported Jake's efforts, called the police, her voice steady despite the chaos. The gang members were too entangled in their disputes as the authorities arrived to resist. Mark, defeated and bitter, was taken into custody. In the midst of it all, Jake used his abilities one last time, revealing the truth behind Chief Watson's death to the arriving officers. Justice, it seemed, would finally be served. The aftermath was a blur of statements and flashing lights. But amid the commotion, Jake and Emma found a moment of quiet. "You did it," Emma said, her eyes reflecting a mix of admiration and relief. "I couldn't have done it without you," Jake replied, his voice heavy with gratitude. He realized then that his abilities, which he had once seen as a curse, had become a part of his identity, a tool for justice and protection. As they left the warehouse, the first light of dawn was breaking. The night's events had marked the end of a dark chapter in Jake's life and the beginning of something new. He had found strength in himself and an ally in Emma. The future was uncertain, but Jake felt ready to face it for the first time, whatever it might bring. Epilogue, a new beginning. Months had passed since the night at the warehouse, and the town had slowly returned to its peaceful rhythms. Jake walked through the familiar streets, a sense of calm in his step that hadn't been there before. He was no longer the boy who hid his abilities nor the one trapped in Mark's dangerous games. The incident had become a part of the town's whispered lore, but for Jake, it was a pivotal chapter in his life's story. He had faced his fears, stood up for justice, and learned to accept himself. As he neared the local park, he saw Emma sitting on a bench, her eyes lost in a book. Her role in all that had transpired was not just as a rescuer but as a catalyst for Jake's transformation. She looked up and smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached her eyes. They talked about everything and nothing. The normalcy of life was a welcome change. Jake shared his plans for the future. He had decided to embrace his telepathic abilities to use them to help people. Perhaps in law enforcement or counseling, somewhere, he could make a difference. Emma listened, her admiration for Jake evident in her attentive gaze. She spoke of her plans and desire to study law, inspired by her father and the events they had weathered together. As they walked together, the sun setting in a brilliant display of colors, Jake realized how much had changed. He had found an unlikely friend in Emma, a sense of purpose, and a confidence that came from embracing his true self. The story of Jake Martinez, the telepathic teenager, was no longer a tale of fear and hiding. It was a story of growth, courage, and the unanticipated colors of thoughts that shape our lives. The epilogue closes with Jake and Emma looking ahead to the future, a future they were ready to face together, whatever it might hold. Copyright Sard Moki Mohildin 2023.